Hi, and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. Today, our guest is Heather McGowan. She's a future of work strategist and helps leaders prepare their people and organizations for the fourth industrial revolution, and is also the author of the newly released book, The Adaptation Advantage. She speaks and advises extensively on the future of work all over the world, which of course notably contains the rapid advancement of technology, which is shifting the domains of human knowledge work. In this emerging future, humans must continually learn and adapt, and this transition comes with a really significant overload. McGowan's academic work has included roles at Rhode Island School of Design, Becker College, and Jefferson University, where she was the strategic architect of the first undergraduate college focused exclusively on innovation. In 2019, Heather was appointed to the faculty at the Swinburne Centre for the New Workforce in Australia, and it was wonderful to have her come down under to join some of our work down here. She also runs a think tank called Work to Learn, because as we'll hear, McGowan believes that in the third industrial revolution, we learned once. And of course, now with the current realities and shifting converging technologies, we need to work in order to learn continuously. Heather, it's fantastic to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I've been really enjoying the book, of course, but we always ask this question when we start this podcast, which what is or are the big questions that you've been exploring most over your career and in your life generally?
Well, there's many questions I've been exploring over my career, but the one I'm working on lately and most acutely over the last 6 months or more is how much uncertainty can a human being take? Because when Chris Shipley and I wrote the book, Adaptation Advantage, we wrote it in summer to early fall 2019. Right. Coronavirus, for most of us, did not exist. I mean, coronaviruses have existed, but there was no global pandemic. There was no lockdown. There was no massive, what I'm calling a massive social experiment. But there was accelerated technology growth that was starting to decouple people from jobs and tasks from within jobs. It sort of was a beginning of a big unbundling. And the only people I found out there speaking about the future of work over the last 5-10 years were people talking about how technology was going to consume all of work and make a useless class of humans. And I just didn't find that to be true. So that's what started me on the trajectory. But since the virus has kind of upended everything that's a norm for us, the question I'm asking now is how much uncertainty can we take? Because the central thesis of the adaptation advantage is the future of work is learning adaptation. And that means not only do you have to rethink how you do things, but maybe even how you define yourself. And then leadership completely transforms from driving productivity to inspiring human potential on learning tours. And all of these things, you don't have a fixed sense of a lot of things, not a fixed process, not a fixed identity. So that big question of how much uncertainty can we take is one that's forefront for me right now.
Yeah, so I really like that as a question. That's one that we're all struggling with, frankly.
Yeah.
And of course, the idea, and your book covers much of this, as I'm sure your work does, that things are accelerating. Really, the pace of change has never been as fast as it is right now. And of course, it will never be as slow as it is at this point in time. Yep. So this is the idea that change is not just fast, it is accelerating in nature. So, take us through, see the law of accelerating returns, some of the things we know about technology. And then I'd love to talk about the piece around identity, because I find that incredibly compelling, Heather. Sure. In this uncertain world, it's not just about the new ideas, it's letting go of the old. In some ways, that's about who we are and our identities as well, particularly with the way that we show up at work, if we do, physically or otherwise. But also, all those pieces around, the question that we should never ask, which is, well, what do you do? So take us through what you've been exploring, what you've been noticing. And of course, COVID has accelerated that.
Right. So the book's divided in 3 parts, and the book was really written over the course of probably 5 years. When I would finish a talk, and I was doing about 50 a year, people would come up to me and say, that was so much information, it was so great, but I need more time to digest it. Do you have, a video I can take home? Do you have a book? Do you have something? Yeah. And so what I did over the course of the last 100 talks prior to writing the book was sort of ask people, well, what struck you the most? What shifted your thinking the most? What left you wondering, or what left you engaged enough to think, now I know something I can do, as opposed to when people talk about accelerated technology, it leaves people with paralysis. My goal is to help people take that first step.
Yeah.
And so out of that came this kind of three parts, and that's Chris Shipley and I wrote the book in three parts. The first is the context of change, and it was pre-virus, so it was technology-driven change. So technology-driven change, if you follow Moore's law, which is all this stuff does follow, including the virus, it's exponential, which
Yeah.
means every step is double the prior step. So by definition, the slowest rate of change for the rest of your life is right now. So if you're exhausted from yesterday, you're not ready for tomorrow, and it's a lot for humans to take,
Yeah.
because human adaptation is linear in sequential steps. And if you look at linear and exponential steps next to each other, they kind of start out together. You know, linear steps are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exponential steps are 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. Each step is double. So those first two steps are not that far apart, but as further you get along the path, the further they get apart. And that was what we were starting to feel with technology. Now, what the virus did was just accelerate that. McKinsey said they thought that in the first 90 days post-virus, we fast forwarded either 5 to 10 years, somewhere between 5 and 10 years. Because if you look at it, every company that could work remotely did work remotely or does work remotely. Every learning organization from K-12 to corporate learning to universities went 100% online inside of 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I worked for about a decade in higher ed and for presidents and provosts, and you know, they would all tell me, oh, that faculty member will never work online, or that program will never work online, or this will never. And, well, they did inside of 2 weeks, and they did so successfully. So the good news is we're a highly adaptive species when pressed. Well, a question I'm asking myself now is how much more can we take?
Yeah.
And is there any way we can sort of slow this down to catch our breath? So that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book delves into identity. And the third part of the book delves into leadership. And I think you wanted to talk about identity, so I'll just leave it there and let you ask questions about identity.
Yeah. That's a wonderful framing. And I think one of the key things for any leaders in particular, but is understanding not necessarily the details of the technology, but the trends or the principles. So Moore's law, for example, and the law of accelerating returns more generally. I mean, and everyone now knows about an exponential curve. Whereas before,
Right.
you know, because we are linear, our psychology is kind of wired to be linear. We kind of find it difficult to realize, you know, that one step, you know, taken 30 times in a linear way is 30, and one step in an exponential space, you know, is whatever it is, 8 times around the world. So, you know, there's this kind of disconnect that I think we are having to train ourselves to be more and more exponential. And that question about how much is too much, you know, the idea that our minds can stretch, and maybe once stretch, retain that new shape. But I'm sure all of us have some sense of collective fatigue at the sheer pace of change. And there are things like information diets and other things to try to take control, and clearly collective well-being. And we've had this conversation with many of our guests, is becoming more and more seen as, you know, a shared destination of success, as opposed to some of the other kind of more narrow metrics. So take us into the identity piece though, Heather. I'm super, super interested in this, because of course, you know, in our work in education, it's not just about the knowledge, it's not just about the skills, it's about the character and the disposition. And of course, identity is tied up into that. It's who do we think we are? What is our self-concept? So
right.
What did you discover in kind of trying to place down some of those compelling ideas as people were finding them in that piece around identity? What are the questions we should not ask, and what might be the ones that we do?
Yeah, so I started, I got down on this road maybe 4 or 5 years ago. My niece, Izzy, at the time was 4. She called me up one day and she said, Auntie Heather, it's career day tomorrow. And I thought, you're 4 years old. Seriously, it's career day? And she said, yeah, I want to be a unicorn, but my teacher told me that wasn't realistic. And I thought, probably most of the jobs that she will do one day may not even exist yet, or certainly won't look the way they look today. So why are we asking a young person to pick a realistic future when the world's never been moving so quickly? And I was also at the time working for a university. It was so focused on pick your major before you step foot on campus, or now it's dial into Zoom, don't take anything outside your major. And I remember talking to the faculty. I said, how many of you guys are working in the field of your undergraduate major? Raise your hand. All the hands in the room went up. I said, you know what, you're not normal. And that may be a big part of the problem.
Yeah.
Because statistically, from the research I've seen, it's less than a third of the people out there work in the field of their undergraduate major. And that's even if they go to university. And so we're setting these traps that are hindering adaptation. And then I found some other research that job loss can take longer to recover from than the loss of a primary relationship.
Wow.
because it's the loss of everything you've been, trained to believe that you are. So I thought, wow, there's something to this identity thing. And so I started talking about that 3 or 4 years ago. And then as we were writing the book, I was like, we need to really understand more about identity formation. So we interviewed a psychologist from Europe who told us, how we go through these phases of um, exploring what we believe, and we go through that. Do I believe what my parents believe? Do I believe their religious beliefs? Do I believe what they think about the world? What they think about different races? What they think about politically? Whatever the issue may be. Some people don't go through that process. Some people never stop going through that process. And there's sort of a narrative we tell ourselves about our identity. And I thought about how much our system of education, I'm in the US, so it might be more acute in the US, I'm not sure. But I think it's true for much of the developed world, is really honing you towards this singular occupational self.
Yeah.
And research out of the Foundation for Young Australians found that a young person graduating today may have 17 different jobs across 5 different industries, but our entire system is designed to get you to that first job. K-12 is a sorting process to figure out who's going to university. The tail end of K-12 high school was to get you into the right university. The university accepts you based on a program and a major, mostly geared towards probably a singular job. And they declare their success based upon how quickly you were placed and what your starting salary is. And that is the first of a much longer journey that's going to be marked more by how you transition between those opportunities. So that's when I started to say, in the past, we learned once in order to work, and now we're going to have to work in order to learn continuously. And I use visuals like, we used to have these discrete bands of education, career, retire. And once you get out of one band, you got into the other band, you never went back. And now I think it's overlapping bands of learn, leverage, and longevity, and leverage being to signify that work and learning are a combined act. So we almost have to rebuild the whole system, but it starts with the expectation. So it's not about any specific skill, more about tapping into the will to acquire and repeatedly shed skills as needed.
Yeah, fantastic. We know the idea of learning to learn, for example, or meta learning, your understanding of the process of learning for you. And the interesting piece is, considering people will make that argument, but clearly about knowledge or skill. And I think the interesting thing is that we also need to, and I love the quote actually at the beginning of the book, which is from Gilbert, I think.
Dan Gilbert, Works in Progress?
Yes, exactly.
Human beings who are works in progress and mistakenly think they're finished.
It's a really wonderful framing, because I think, so much of our systems generally, not just, K to 12, is about arriving at a point. And of course, we can get quite philosophical. People like Alan Watts, for example, focus on, we never actually arrive. We are constantly in a process of emergence. So as much as we focus on something, we'll get there and there'll be something else. And so there is no interim. There is only the kind of emergent process of identity formation and contribution. So I'm really fascinated in that. It's a personal question. What's been your journey in terms of learning and identity? Because clearly all these ideas are quite compelling. How do you feel that you've embodied them, or, really discovered their meaning on your own journey, so doing some really quite wonderful things across the world and education and corporate spaces?
When you're a little kid, if you're told you're smart or special, it's a huge trap. And I know so many adults that, were the smartest kids in their high school, or they kept in the football team or basketball team or swimming team or whatever it was. And that's the early cast of their identity that they never quite shed. And there's something in the book we talk about called the expertise curse. And there was a study done that even if you take a group of people and you deem some people in the group experts, even if they don't have the knowledge and skills to be that experts, they'll discard any information that confronts what's their stated expertise. And I think that happens for a lot of folks. And fortunately for me, I was never meeting expectations. I was the kid who always had to go have her IQ taken because they were like, she seems smart, but her grades aren't so great. She seems like she doesn't have a direction, but she seems to be exploring a lot of things. I don't know where this is going. And unfortunately, I had fantastic parents that encouraged those explorations. So I wasn't, on a track to become a lawyer or doctor or any set thing. My parents just sort of let me go and give me as many resources as they could to travel on that journey. And I had an incredible number of jobs. And I
Mm.
like speaking of jobs, I like Steve Jobs' analogy that, or explanation that his career makes sense looking backwards,
Yeah.
but not forwards, that, studying calligraphy led to fonts in the Mac and that sort of thing. And, I started in art school, and I got into an art school nobody ever thought I'd get into. It was one of the best in the world, and by chance I got in. Nobody expected that. And then I worked in design, and then I started asking a bunch of business questions. So I went and got an MBA, and everybody thought I'd go back to product design, but I ended up going to finance and social responsible investing, and then I landed in academia, and then just out of frustration, and I didn't think anybody was really explaining the world as it was sort of rapidly unfolding. I started writing and speaking. First, I wrote on LinkedIn, and my second article, 100,000 people read it in 24 hours, and I started getting speaking requests all over the world. And then
Wow.
videos of my talks went viral, and now I have like 15 speakers bureaus that represent me, and this is all I do. So it was, I couldn't have planned it. I didn't apply to be a future work strategist. It's a term I made up to try to explain some of the things, I'm doing.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be true for a lot of people, but
Yeah.
not everybody can fly like that without a net.
Mm. That's a really compelling story. And I think, you know, even a generation ago, 25 years ago, we would see those people with that kind of trajectory as, the exception.
Mad.
And
Mad, probably.
and I wonder now, and I do think, I don't know about if you would describe yourself as a pessimist or an optimist. I like to self-identify, although just lightly, so that I can, change my identity as I move forward, as an action-based optimist, because of course I think we need to, envisage the best version of the future, and then, deliberately act and behave in ways to try to bring that about. But I wonder about young people today, and many of them, the idea of a side hustle is just the vernacular of young people. So
Yeah.
this idea, I think, of being far more agile, and I think, you do speak to this as well, about letting go of occupational identities. And so the questions we should not ask, and the way that we narrow or converge systems towards a singular point, isn't just unhelpful, it's counterproductive often to what we know is going to be the emerging future.
Yeah, and I think if I were to sort of frame how we need to treat young people, stop complaining that they want more. We have trashed the world for them in so many ways. We've not addressed climate change. That's the shame of the last few generations. We have left them with an exponential, an existential challenge.
Yeah.
We've got issues of income inequality in most of the developed world we have not addressed. I think we should give them whatever tools we can and get out of their way, because they've proven every single time, whether it's, in the US with the Parkland kids who stood up and created a movement around to stop school shooting, or it's Greta in Sweden around climate change. They are ready to lead, and we need to get out of their way and let them do it their own. They are naturally entrepreneurial. They grew up with digital tools, so they don't think about that as any singular skill or ending skill. They just think it's part of their literacy.
Yeah.
And so we just need to coach and support them in any way we can.
I'd love you to talk a bit about leadership, because leadership is an action, not a role. And as we're just in terms of talking about young people right now. So, what is it about leading in this continuous change environment that shifts what a leader, not just what a leader does or what they know, but ultimately who they are, and the kind of presencing piece to this, which I think is really interesting. And, how this links to things like consciousness development, for example, the self-organizing mind as opposed to the socializing mind. It's some of the really interesting work that's being done in that space. So, the idea of evolving leadership as an entire construct, what are some of the interesting things that we should pay attention to?
Well, the second and third industrial revolutions, and some people trash those terms, but they do give us a framework to think about periods of time. So the second industrial revolution was electrification and automation of some manufacturing. The third industrial revolution was computerization, and the fourth is sort of the augmented human and Internet of Things, and this merging of cyber, physical and biological systems. In the second and third, leadership was a right. You were sort of deemed a leader. You were the expert. You were the boss, not to be questioned. Your job was to just drive as much productivity as you could out of humans or machines. And the fourth industrial revolution, if you accept that framing of just the shifts we're making, is really about, let's let the machines do the things that the machines do well. Let's let the humans do the things that humans do well. And when you parse it out that way, it's humans tinker, humans improvise, Humans innovate. Humans are innately curious if you let them. So it becomes much more of a responsibility than a right. It becomes much more about inspiring human potential. It's much more about being a vulnerable leader who can establish psychological safety so you can lead teams on learning tours. And that leadership becomes sort of a bit of role fluidity. Different people on the team emerge as leaders in different phases of the process. So it really, some of the identity stuff really comes into play because you can't be that expert who can't be questioned
Yeah.
in this world that I envision.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So take us from the leadership perspective into an organizational one, and specifically, schools, universities, companies. But what is it about that human potential in a team like setting that you're seeing is crucial around putting adaption, for example, in the center? The way that we design job roles, for example, really quite tangible ways that we might be able to restructure. And again, COVID has, as you say, just shifted really the Overton window in what's considered reasonable.
Yeah.
Entire billion-dollar institutions just really pivoting overnight, shifting their entire learning model. So what is it about the organizational structures that you think we should think about?
Well, I think it's important to understand that in the last, say, 20 years or so, and then going back to, maybe 65 years, companies lasted longer, businesses lasted longer, business models lasted longer, products lasted longer. So in an organization, you could set up a sort of rigid organizational structure because you were sort of setting things up to be repetitive, cognitively repetitive, physically repetitive. And so the product you were producing didn't change for set periods of time, so processes we could become sort of stayed. And now we're looking at a world where if it's meant to be predictable, an algorithm's going to soon be able to do it. So the other work is the messy stuff where you're not necessarily just mass producing a unit of value, but a lot of times you're not even working on the answer to a question, but you're forming the question itself. So that suggests, you can't have a rigid box where you say, this is the job and I need to find somebody who fits in this box based upon past skills and experience, because mostly you're looking for somebody to do something that's never done before. So you're suddenly screening people not based on what they can do today, but what they might be able to do tomorrow. Are their values aligned with the culture and the mission of the organization? Do they have the capacity to step into whatever thing you're starting to do today, knowing that you're mostly hiring them to do an unknown tomorrow? That's a very different proposition. It's a very different screening process. It's a very
Yeah.
different organizational structure. It's much more fluid and very, very different leadership.
Yeah. Again, there's some really interesting, I would say, semi-large scale experiments of this work. So we can think about reinventing organizations by Lalou and the idea of teal organizations. Think about Zappos, for example, and moving to holocracy, where you just dissolve all hierarchy. And of course, one of the criticisms, and it's an interesting one, is that, well, when organizations do these things, a good fifth of their workforce leave because it's so different. And I think this kind of just links to our point: how much ambiguity is too much ambiguity. Heather, I'd love you to just make the case for adaption. I would say most people listening to this podcast, as educators and leaders, would clearly see the need. But there are some people that say, well, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, and clearly it's broken in many regards. There are ways. What do we need to say to those people to really, to create a compelling case for change? I mean, people that say, well, the education system works by and large,
Yeah,
or
that's such a funny thing because when you screen, like at least I know this data from the U.S., you will screen faculty and administrators in higher ed institutions, and I believe it's also true with K-12. And they'll say, "Oh yeah, the education system works just as it is." 70% agree, and then you ask the students, and 40% agree, and then you ask the employers, and 20% agree. So we've got a mismatch between the three sets of stakeholders. It may work in your view in terms of you are producing the same sort of product you produced 10 years ago, But the market, and the market for students that, get hired upon graduation from K-12 or K-12 in the university systems, is looking for something very different. I mean, all the work that I did, almost all the work I did in university was undoing the work that was done in K-12. Will it be on the test is the first thing you got to try to get rid of. Because most of the work we do in the world in the last 2 decades has been a 50% increase in collaboration. Yet we focus on finding the singular right answer and patting people on the back for doing it, when that singular right answer is completely irrelevant in the world of work.
That's really compelling, and I like this notion of, and others have spoken about this. How do we stay with the problem longer? How do we do problem finding as opposed to just the problem solving, which often, or collaborative problem solving, that often gets a lot of attention.
Yeah, if I could just on that note, the best I've seen on this in terms of K-12, and I don't know how you scale it because it was done at a small scale, but I think some folks working on scaling it, is the Comm Lab School in San Francisco, which is the folks from Khan Academy said, if we made a face-to-face school, we'd have to experiment with our own children. It's only fair. So it's all children, or it started as all children who've worked for Khan Academy. And they said, okay, let's just throw everything out and rebuild as if we build today for the world that we think these young people are going to enter. So no grades, no grade levels, no set subject matter time. The day has a beginning and an end to it, but students are organized by their independence level as opposed to their age.
That's interesting.
Everybody works through competencies as opposed to seat time subjects. Everybody has a passion project, so they're constantly connecting to their sense of agency. And everybody is a teacher as well as a learner. So if I'm particularly good in math, then it's my responsibility to help others. If I'm particularly good in languages, it's my responsibility to help others, and that reinforces your own learning. I went into this classroom, it was unbelievable. These kids were so self-directed and doing things at levels so far above what they'd be if you put them in a class and said, well, you're 10, so you got to sit here and have math for 45 minutes, and then you need to go sit here and have social studies for 35 minutes. If you move through the competencies, get right to your research project and your teaching.
I really feel, the key word here in terms of the way that we design schools might be liberation. and that's not just for, for all the human beings in that system. So, teachers overwhelmingly choose to become teachers because they want to make a positive impact. And then somehow we just, handcuff them with these particular types of frames that eventually we all get stuck in, and that it's really interesting. The piece around, and this I think links to the expert paradox, or the expertise trap.
Curse.
Curse, which, the idea that how do we have a novice mindset, and how do we go back to first principles? So, and this is why really, I think, just a little bit of reform or shaping around the edges probably is not going to get us where we need to be. And the thing that I think is quite interesting, Heather, is the idea that the market, in a corporate space, the market just makes those decisions. As the old saying is, you innovate or you evaporate. You effectively have to respond because, there is an agency and autonomy in your customer or your client base. And I think in a lot of other systems, we just kind of are running on old assumptions and past paradigms. And so the big question that I often explore in these conversations is, how do we shift the entire system from one that's mechanistic and kind of set in a particular paradigm to one that's more of an emerging learning ecosystem where people see it ecologically with all of the different factors playing a role. And I think, the Comm Lab School is a great example of that.
Yeah, it's great. There are a bunch of examples of people experimenting like that, but we have to kind of look back to how did we get here? Yeah. And we started compulsory education because we needed farm workers to learn to be factory workers. And that's why the desks were all in a row, just like they were going to stand in rows in the factory floor. And we just haven't ever broken away from that paradigm. And then, the more we need to prove learning puts us in a situation where we're asking students to basically be algorithmic in their thinking, which means we're actually preparing people to compete with robots. So I wonder if this virus is a moment that allows us to stop and say, well, what are we doing? Yeah. And on that note, I have to say, the teachers out there who are zoomed out and I know you're absolutely zoomed out or
Yeah.
teamed out or whatever platform you're on. My heart goes out to you because I know that you're doing the best you can to try to keep kids engaged right now, and parents, all the parents out there, also part-time teachers, at minimum part-time teachers, because they're trying to get their kids to be in Zoom. So everybody's working double time in every direction. So it's a hard conversation to have right now,
Yeah.
but it's also a really important one to have right now because we might be doing things right now that are completely futile.
Mm. That's really interesting. I wonder what your perspective would be on, it has been called the Great Pause or the Great Reckoning.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Tomfoolery.
yeah, that's right. Although, crises like COVID-19, they disrupt, but they also reveal.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
are we paying attention? It's the Netflix question.
Yeah.
Are we still there? Are we paying attention? And so, what's your hope from this point forward? As a futurist, particularly around work and learning systems, what's your hope that we might seize from this particular moment in our collective human journey that will get us closer? What do you think some of those steps that might take? Not that we can never predict or be certain, but perhaps we can kind of be hopeful.
Well, I think this forced social experiment is telling us a few things. Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. And his uh, analogy, he meant towards, a broken business model can be concealed by a raging market. But I think you could take that same analogy to say that, when everything seems to be going okay and it's not being revealed, we don't realize how much racism we have, or income inequality, or political unrest, or, disparities, health disparities, and the virus is certainly making that clear. But when it comes to education, I think that in education and work, both in that first 2 weeks to 90 days, everybody could teach online, went online. Everybody could work from home. Now what we need to figure out is, instead of saying, how do we go back? It's,
Yeah.
what did we learn in this moment? What kinds of things can be taught online? What kinds of ways can we help students be self-directed learners so that they do projects on their own and they start directing their own learning, because they're not in a classroom with other students and with a teacher looking at them. They have a little more free time to manage their own calendar and time. How can we make sense of that? And how can we, from a work standpoint, if we can do everything on Zoom, why would we ever go to an office again? I actually think we do need to go to offices again. I think there are serendipitous conversations. I think
Yeah.
there are subtleties to the way we communicate in person that are different. I think it's interesting that Microsoft did an analysis, because they have, teams and calendars. They analyze their own data, that meetings were kind of always standardly set at an hour, 45 minutes, but now everybody's doing them in 20 to 30 minutes. And there are more of them. So the way we organize and communicate is changing. I think we actually have a lot of opportunity with this technology to be more transparent about our biases. Like,
Mm.
for example, if you and I are on Zoom and there are 5 people on here and there are 4 men and 1 woman, or 4 white people and 1 minority, if the person who's ever the minority is in the group, whether it's a racial or gender minority, can't get a word in edgewise and is constantly interrupted. If we were in a face-to-face conversation, if I were that person, I would say, hey, listen, I tried to talk, but you guys kept interrupting me. You might say, well, you're imagining it. If you're doing it over technology, there's a digital exhaust you can sort through there. You could
Mm.
become more aware of your own behaviors. And not in a punitive way, but in a way that we can all be more inclusive. I mean, the whole D&I, the second I, is inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of opportunities for transparency with kind of sorting through the digital exhaust we're creating. There's also an opportunity to see all the different ways that telepresence can save us time. If you can dial up your doctor and say, hey, listen, I got this rash on my elbow. Do I need to come in? And they say, oh, no, you just put some antibiotic ointment on it. You'll be fine. You just saved, 3 hours.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways that I think we're going to learn a tremendous amount out of this period of time. And I'm hopeful that we come out of it with better mechanisms for understanding when learning takes place, when it can be self-directed, when it can be through telepresence, and when we need to be in person for both work and learning.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And of course, potentially have a higher, or a healthier, more productive lifestyle emerge, because we have thrown off some of those. Effectively, the pause has been long enough in most parts of the world. In fact,
Yep.
the danger for us in some parts in Australia is that we've kind of successfully beaten it. So that we're not perhaps considering those deeper questions as much, but you know, the
Yeah,
idea
in
of
the US for slower learners, but maybe we'll get more out of it.
maybe so. Heather, it's been a fabulous conversation and a real thrill to speak with you. I want to ask you a final question, which really is, in a sentence, what is your take home message for learners about, the future of work and the future of society?
We always celebrate the successes and we think about the highlights on whether it be our learning journey or our work journey being, getting that job, defending that dissertation, getting that degree, getting into that institution, successful presentations at work, whatever it may be. You actually don't learn much from successes. You learn a lot from hard moments. And in the book, Chris Shipley and I both talk about some hard moments in our lives. It's the stuff that kind of rocks you back on your feet and sometimes goes right to your core that gets you to think differently. It hurts sometimes. So anybody out there who's lost their job, and there's a lot of them,
Yeah.
This might be the greatest learning moment of your life, setting you on a much better path if you're open to accepting it. So I say, I think it's the Navy or the Marines or something that says embrace the suck in the US military. It sort of is like that, take those hard moments because there can be tremendous learning opportunities that, strengthen you in new and interesting ways.
Heather McGowan, an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and congratulations on the book, and really wish you well into the future, exploring what it might be for all of us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Heather. Wonderful conversation. And I hope at some point in the not too distant future, the early 2020s rather than the late 2020s, we can cross paths in person in Melbourne somewhere perhaps. And I
was supposed to be there in June.
Yeah, I would have thought
I speak at AMP annually, and or every other year I speak at AMP, and I'm supposed to be there.
Yeah, great. Wonderful stuff. If you ever need anything, or you want a connection to someone in the education space, please let me know. I know that you have a plethora of connections anyway. But one piece of work I'll mention, I didn't mention this on the podcast because I actually care more about what you have to say, but we're doing some really interesting stuff at Learning Creates Australia with Tony Mackay, Jan Owen, and others. You may know, I imagine you know some of these people.
I know Jan, yeah.
Yeah, great. So, and Sandra Milligan, who runs the ARC at University of Melbourne, is doing a lot of work on micro-credentials and the way that we shift. Our entire mission is really to try to shift the entire education system by changing the way that we measure what we have, because then of course we start to value that. So we are going after ATAR, but not in the same activistic way that some are, to say, let's just dismantle it. It still plays a role. We want to replace it with something better so that everyone eventually moves away from that metric, knowing that it corrupts the entire K-12. And your point was quite pertinent about universities having to undo so much of K-12. I mean, this is the idea of an ecosystem of actually having a human-centered journey where young people are equipped by the system, not just by themselves, and having to do all that heavy lifting in spite of the system. So yeah, there's some really interesting stuff that we're working on, and I hope that we get there. We'll see.
Yeah, keep me posted and let me know what you think of the book as you finish it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. And the last thing I'll say, that identity piece is what's missing from so much of this conversation. Yeah. It's like, even the SU stuff, right? That's like the kind of techno optimist, like, Rays and others. And you do talk a bit about that. It's great. Yeah. And there needs to be that level of source of identity required. Yeah. It's why I like the Theory U piece from MIT and Otto Sharma and others, how do we do the identity bit? Because otherwise no one's going to, it's actually change leadership always, right? How do we enable others to change? And it's only enablement. We can't force anyone. So thank you for spending your afternoon with me. And I really, really wish you well. Fantastic work.
All right.
Thanks
so
Heather.
much. Take
Stay
care.
well out there. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.